Swifter, we're going to be using the DarkSky API, but there's nothing but blue skies ahead in your Swifty career. We're going to learn to use URLSession to access data over the web. So we're going to work with APIs. In fact, we're not only going to get weather data from DarkSky, but we're going to get Pokemon data from another API. We're going to extend a browser to display formatted JSON. We're going to construct a reusable function that will accept any valid API URL and return JSON data. We'll print JSON to the console in Xcode, and we'll use Google Maps to confirm a latitude and longitude. Let's go! In this video, we're going to be accessing data from the DarkSky Weather Service. Now, we get data using what's called an API. An API stands for Application Programming Interface. You can consider APIs to be a set of standards, programming hooks, or guidelines that exchange data with another service. And we see APIs everywhere. So if you've ever seen Uber, for example, in Google Maps, OpenTable, or an airline app, well, that happens because these firms are using Uber's API to link with their service. And that's why APIs are such a powerful business tool. They allow a firm to expand their reach to a much larger distribution footprint than they would if they try to do everything themselves. Now, there are lots of publicly available APIs that you can find by searching the web. One of the best sources is a site called ProgrammableWeb.com. And if you search there, you can find APIs that provide information about Marvel movies and comics, recipes, animal shelter information, transit schedules, and more. Now, some organizations charge for API access, others offer them entirely for free, and even those that charge often offer a trial period or don't start payment unless the number of API calls in a period reach a particular threshold. Now, DarkSky has an API. We're going to be using that. This is made available for free up to 1,000 calls a day, so it's a really great product for us to use. Not only does it have wonderful data, but it's also great for us to learn about APIs, accessing data, and parsing data in the JSON format. Now, DarkSky is going to keep track of how many times you make an API call by giving you a unique API key that just you should have access to. So head over to the DarkSky website and request an API key. You can do that by going to darksky.net. They'll probably show you a weather forecast, but then click on DarkSky API, click on Try for Free, sign up there with your email address, create a password, and then once you get your DarkSky API key, come on back and you'll be ready to work through the rest of the video. Now, when you get your DarkSky API key, make sure you save it. For now, I'd suggest opening up a Google Doc in another browser tab and pasting your key in there. And again, you'll need to use your own API key. I'm going to change my key after I post this video, so mine won't work. And now once you paste in your key, why don't we head back to the DarkSky website where you requested your API, go up top where there's a Docs link, click that, and then on the left-hand side, look for where it says Forecast Request, and click that as well. Now, under the example request, you'll see a URL. Highlight that and copy it. You want just the URL starting with the HTTPS and going through what are latitude and longitude coordinates at the end. Don't highlight the get in the beginning. And this URL will send back a weather forecast in the JSON format. And this URL is an example of how you'd format a URL to send a request to DarkSky's API that would send back weather forecast data. And it contains 3 parts. The first part is the base URL for getting the forecast. That's the HTTPS api.darksky.net/forecast. And then after the slash, you see the API key. Now, this API key doesn't work. It's just a sample one. This is where you'll eventually put yours in. Then after this, there's another slash. And then after that, there's a longitude and latitude separated by a comma. And very important, there are no spaces in there. I've seen students accidentally add spaces, especially between longitude and latitude. If there's a space in there, it's not a valid URL that will work with DarkSky. You also want to make absolutely sure that you have slashes that separate the key on either end. So go ahead, highlight the sample URL, copy it, and then let's return to our Google Doc and paste it right below your API key. And now with the sample copy pasted into your Google Doc, highlight and copy your API key, then double-click on the section of the sample URL that holds the bogus API key. That'll highlight the character string between the 2 slashes, and then paste your API key over this sample one. And now you've got a URL that you can use to get weather at the coordinates listed at the end of this URL that are roughly 42.36 minus 71.05. Let's try it out. So highlight the modified URL, copy it, open up a new browser tab, paste it in there and press return, and oh, this does not look good. Now, the data we're seeing is correct. It's just not formatted so that it's easy to read. But fear not, both Chrome and Safari have free extensions that we can install to format JSON so it'll be easier to read and explore. Now I suggest using Chrome, and I'll show you the JSON formatter that I use. It has little expansion triangles to make it easy to show or hide portions of the JSON, which is super useful when you don't want to look at all of the results provided by a particularly large returned data set. So first, here's how you would install a JSON formatter in Chrome. First, let's go to the Chrome store. So I'm going to go up to the search for Google Chrome Store using a Google Chrome browser, of course. Then you should see a link that says Google Chrome Web Store. Click on that. Then I'll search for JSON formatter. There are quite a few, but this one up top has a 5-star rating and a lot of reviews. So I'll go ahead and select this. Click the Add to Chrome button. Click Add Extension to confirm your intent. And then you'll see a message that says JSON formatter has been added to Chrome. Excellent. Now make sure that you've got a copy of the URL with your API key on your clipboard and paste this URL into a browser tab, and we see the results magnificently formatted with our little expansion triangles on the left. Good work. And just a quick note for anyone using Safari, if you paste your URL into Safari, you'll also see the gnarly unformatted JSON. The reason I suggest Chrome as your browser instead of Safari is, at the time of my recording, I wasn't able to find any free Safari extensions that have the little triangles on the left for expansion, and those are really handy. You'll want to use those. But if for some reason you need to use Safari, these are the steps you can go through to get at least a basic free JSON formatter extension. So if you go under the Safari menu, there's a Safari Extensions menu option. Select that. That'll open the Mac App Store. When I open it up, I see a page that encourages me to browse all extensions. I don't want to do that, so I'll click Done. Then we can search for Safari JSON. This first one that shows up, JSON Peep, is free. A quick scan of even the ones that charge for a modest fee doesn't show expansion triangles, although I didn't look thoroughly, so feel free to explore if you're really committed to using Safari. Right now, I'll go ahead and install a Safari extension called JSON Peep. Mine shows a little cloud because I've actually installed it before, but I deinstalled it for this demo. But I'll click the cloud to download. You probably have a different icon there. You should see an open button when your extension's been downloaded, so click that. Then you see a button that says Open Safari Preferences. That's where you'll approve the extension, just to make sure it's checked. And if it is, you can close this window, and I'll just click in the URL space at the top of my browser and press Enter so it reloads again, and it reloads in nicely formatted JSON. And besides the extensions, there are also websites and other apps where you can copy unformatted JSON and paste it in for formatting, but it's super easy to have the browser do this automatically for you. It avoids the extra steps. So once you've got a solution for formatting JSON, hopefully you're able to do it in the browser. Come on back. We're ready to get our app to access the JSON. So back in our code, now we've got this weather location class, and we're going to put our method, the function to access weather data, right in here for now. Eventually, we're going to create a new class based on this class that has even more properties where we can store all of our weather data. But first things first, let's just make sure that we can get our weather data. Now to get our data from DarkSky, we're going to be using the iOS class URLSession. And to do this, we need to perform a bunch of steps. First, we need to create a URL. Now we've already got the URL as a string, but we need to convert it to a special URL data type. And this is the code to do that. Now we can be pretty sure that it's going to work, but it doesn't hurt to put some error handling in there, especially if you'll be reusing this code in other apps in the future. And you can, since the code that we're going to write is going to be highly reusable. Next, we create a URL session. This is the main object in charge of sending and receiving data. And this code is how we create that object. Then we create a task, and there are 3 possible tasks for a URL session: data tasks, upload tasks, and download tasks. We'll deal with data tasks here. Those don't save anything to disk, but you'll almost always use data tasks when working with JSON data downloaded from an API. Then we'll evaluate the results. The data task method can return 3 values: data, which is where our JSON data will be stored if everything works as planned; response, which we'll temporarily ignore, but this can include information like server response codes in case the web server wants to tell you anything about its status; and error, which hopefully we will never see, but if we do, we'll print out a description of the error. Then, and this is easy to forget, we need to make sure that we call the .resume method on our task, otherwise it won't run. And we also need to make sure that we call getData somewhere in our code after it launches, or we won't see any results because we never run getData. So this is another thing I've seen from students, is they write this great data access function, and then they forget to call it someplace in their code when their code runs. So now back in our weather location class, let's go ahead and write this getData function. So right underneath our initializer, we'll say func getData, open and close parentheses. We're not passing in any values yet, but we'll have to deal with this later on when we put in an escaping completion handler. We'll ignore that for now. Then open and close curlies, and first let's set up our URL string. So for now, and we'll change this later on, but inside of getData, let's just create a constant called URL string. So we'll say let URL string equals, and then in between the double quotes, return to your browser where that tab is open to the Google Doc where you had pasted in a working URL that we know gets data from DarkSky. highlight that, copy that, and paste it in between the double quotes. Then we need to create a URL, and again, that's a special URL data type that exists in iOS. So we'll say guard let URL equals URL, then open parens string. Now note that this method creates an optional URL using a string, see the question mark? That's why we are using the guard let. Now, since we're pretty confident that our URL will work because we just entered it in a web browser and we saw data, we could force unwrap this with an exclamation point. But if you want to reuse this code, and you will, then it's a good idea to put in some error checking here that deals with the nil possibility using guard let. So press return to accept this statement. Then what we're going to pass in as the value is URL string. That's the string we just created in the constant above. Then we'll put in our fail condition. So if we can't guard against this, we'll say else, and then in between the curlies, print, and we'll put the return statement in here because you always need to return inside of the fail part of a guard. And for the error, we'll just print angry emoji, capital error, could not create a URL from string interp. URL string. And up above this, I think it's always useful as a developer to print out your URL before you go ahead and try to convert it and then make a call using URLSession. This way, if you run into some problems, you can just go down to the console and grab the URL that's printed out there, copy it and paste it into the browser to make sure that it works. So just above here, we'll say print. And since this is going to be the URL, we'll put in the web emoji and we'll say we are accessing the URL string interp URL string. Then the next step is to create a URL session. So we'll do that with just let session equals and then capital URL session dot shared. Then we need to get the data with the data task method. So we'll create that task saying let task equals session dot data task. And you want to select this one down here, which is with URL and with completion handler, with these three things after it, the data, URL response, and error. And you can see what it says up in code completion. The description is creates a task that retrieves the contents of a specific URL and then calls a handler on completion. This is exactly what we want, so press return. And we'll put in URL as the first parameter. And then after completion handler, double click on that big gray space. And what that will do is it will convert it to the trailing closure format with the open and close curlies. So this makes this easier to read. And the data task could give us three different values here. So we'll name them data, response, and error. And in between the curlies, we'll handle the error first. So we'll say if let error equals error. That means the error is not nil. That means we got an error, open and close curlies. And we'll print capital error, colon, string interp. And inside we'll put error dot localized description. And in front, angry emoji. After this, I'm just going to put in a comment in here that says, note, there are some additional things that could go wrong when using URLSession, but we shouldn't be experiencing them. So we'll ignore testing for these things right now. And it really is fine for our example. So we're going to ignore the server response. We don't need any of those codes. In some situations, you might want to test to make sure that you're getting JSON back. We've already tested this out, so we know it's going to work. Nothing here is particularly risky. And now it's time to deal with the data. Now we're going to try to turn the data that we get back into JSON. So we do that with JSON serialization, and that could throw an error. So we'll do that within a do catch statement. So we'll do, open and close curlies, catch, open and close curlies, and then in between the do curlies, we'll say let, all lowercase JSON, so that could be any constant we're creating, but we'll call it JSON because it's JSON, equals try, and then JSON serialization dot JSON object, and we'll choose this one with options. And notice this JSON object method throws an error. So I knew that in advance, so that's why I put it inside of do catch, and also why we have try in front of it. And with is the data that we just got back. That's one of those three possible values that's returned from the data task up here, data response error. So we'll put in data, lowercase letters, exclamation point, and our options, it wants an array here. We have no array to pass in. No options are going to be used for this. So we'll just do open and close square brackets. Now, eventually we'll convert this JSON into our own data type so that we can display it in our app. But for now, let's just print out the JSON. So we'll say print string interp, lowercase JSON. And printing out JSON, I think, is pretty cool because we got that over the web. So I'll put in sunglasses emoji. And if the try statement throws an error, we'll never get to the print. So we'll be down here in the catch area and we'll just say print, capital JSON error, colon, string interp, error, localized description, angry emoji. So now we've set up our task. Just after that close curly, we've got to say task.resume, open and close parens. And then this is vitally important. Again, this is one of the things that I've seen students do lots of times and forget about this. We just wrote a really great data access method, but we haven't called it yet. So it will never execute. So we'll never see results. So we have to find a good place to call this. Why don't we call it right at the end of update user interface that's inside of the location detail view controller. So click location detail view controller, and right here as the last line in update user interface, and you can do a quick shift command K to make sure that Xcode knows about this method, but we can type in weather location dot, and look at that, our get data method is in here. So press return to accept this. I'm gonna change my scheme to the simulator, build and run. Now we're not gonna see anything new in the app, but if we take a look down in the console, oh! Let's open up the console so we can see what's going on here, and this looks like a bunch of JSON, just like we saw in DarkSky in the web browser. In fact, let's copy the URL over here. After our nice web emoji that we put in to make sure that that was easy to find, highlight the URL, copy it, head over to your browser, paste it in, and hey, we see the same exact thing on this web page that we're retrieving in the console of our app. Good work! API call successful. URL session mastered. Now just to show you how generic this code is, and again, there are ways to write this code even more reusably. They involve more advanced concepts. In our intro course, we're trying to put a few of those aside, but you wrote code that's very reusable as is, that you can copy and paste and use in subsequent apps. Let's prove that. Let's comment out the URL string up here for DarkSky. We're going to want to use that in a bit. Then underneath, we'll say let URL string equals, and in between double quotes, let's put in a URL for another API. What should we use? Are you ready to catch them all? Let's go to the Pokemon API. Head to your browser, open a tab, do a search for Pokemon API. It should show up right up top. Click on that link. And oh, look at all this ash-ketchum-y goodness. Down here we see examples of the API call. The kind folks who run this API don't even require us to have an API key, so we're going to put in the following. Type this right into your browser as the URL. PokeAPI.co/API/v2/Pokemon/. I know this is going to work, so I'm going to highlight the URL here so I can use it in my app later. Command C to copy, then press return, and let's see what we get. Holy squirtles, Professor Oak, look at this. We got a list of a whole bunch of Pokemon in here. Let's see if we can use this in our app. Head back to our code, paste that Pokemon API URL that we just tested, that we know works, in between the double quotes in our getData function. Now we're going to do the same exact setup of a URL session, but with this as our URL. So when we build and run, look what we got down in here. Ho-ho, a whole list of Pokemon. Doesn't that just warm your heart? So we can catch them all now, Swift style. Let's return to our code, and we'll delete this URL string line with the Pokemon API. We want to continue to work with DarkSky, so we'll uncomment out the line that we'd commented out before that's got our DarkSky URL. And now this URL has our API key in it. So just before we finish this video lesson, we don't want to share that API key publicly on GitHub, so why don't you highlight and copy the entire contents of this string. And then, why don't we break this apart and store it in our secret API keys.swift file. Now remember, in an earlier video, we learned how to hide that using gitignore. Well, let's keep using that for this API key. So why don't we click on API keys.swift in the navigator. And you know what? While we're at it, why don't we also create a constant in that file to hold the URL for our API? I'm going to put a new struct. I could put this in another file, but it's fine in this case to put them both in the same file. So if I broke these out as separate files, then they'd be easier to find just by looking in the navigator. If I named this file constants, it would reflect that there's more than just API keys in here. When you develop, you can use whatever preference you like, but to speed things along, I'm just going to put it right in the API keys file. And so right underneath the existing struct, after its closing curly, I'll say struct API URLs, open and close curly. Then I'll create this static let constant. Remember, static means that I don't need to instantiate API URLs first. I can just refer to the type name dot, and then I want to call this constant DarkSky URL. I'll set that equal to the URL that I just copied. Now I don't want to include everything in here, so I'm going to double click to highlight this string, which is my API key for DarkSky. Cut that out with a Command X. I'm also going to highlight and delete the coordinates, but make absolutely sure that you have a slash after the word forecast here. Otherwise, you won't have a properly formed URL. Then up in API keys, we'll add a new line that says static let DarkSky key equals, and then in between the double quotes, I'm going to paste in my API key. Please paste in yours. By the time you watch this video, this key won't work. Then head back to weatherlocation.swift, and we'll construct the URL string now in between the double quotes with a bunch of string interpolations. So I'll put in string interp. I'll shift Command K to make sure that Xcode knows about the structs and constants I just set up, and that's why I'm being asked to stop what's running in the background. And then API URLs dot DarkSky URL, and that'll give get me this first part from HTTPS all the way through the slash after forecast. Then I'll do another string interp, no space in between, and in there I'll put in API keys.DarkSky key. Now, when you form URLs like this, it can be a little tricky because you need to make sure that your URL string is perfectly formed. No extra characters, no spaces. Make sure that you have slashes or any separator characters that you need. We definitely want to put in an extra slash here, and that's because if you take a look at the URL down here, you can see that we have the key, slash, and then the coordinates, and there's no slash in our key. So we have to add this extra slash as a literal inside the double quotes, and it will show up in red, and then right after this, we'll put in another string interpolation to hold our coordinates. And hey, why don't we do this in the line above? We'll create another constant, which is going to be a string that's got the longitude and latitude separated by a comma. So we'll call that coordinates. We'll say let coordinates equals, and then in between double quotes, string interp, latitude, then outside of the string interp, but before the quotes, comma, no space, very important. I mentioned some students have put spaces in here in the past, and it screwed up their URL, so it didn't work. So after our comma, no space, string interp, longitude. Now I can delete this old URL string down here, which was causing me an error. I just had that in there for reference. And in between this final string interp in my URL string, I'm going to put in the new constant coordinates. Now let's build and run and check out how things look. And if we're lucky, we should be able to get the weather not just for one set of coordinates, but for the coordinates of any weather location that we select. Let's see. So here's our running app. Let's just see if we're properly building URLs with the coordinates for the location we're displaying. So I'm going to swipe first over to Boston College. There's so much data to scroll through. Yikes. And we're only going to use a portion of this. Let's see, and if I haven't scrolled past it yet, the last URL posted via URLSession was this one here that passed in coordinates 42.335 and some numbers, comma, negative 71.168 and some numbers. Now, as we look at the weather results in here, I can confirm that it is indeed 53 degrees Fahrenheit as I record this. So let's head over to Google Maps to verify that these are Boston College's coordinates. You can do this by searching for a location, then right-click on the location and select what's here, and at the bottom, you will see the latitude and longitude, and hey, same number, 42.335 and some, comma, negative 71.168. Looking good. Let's try some others. Let's swipe over to San Francisco State. They should be at a decidedly different coordinates than Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. Let's look them up in Google Maps. We'll right-click here on SFSU. What's here? And they are at coordinates 37,724 minus 122,480. Is that what we got? Well, we can also filter the results in our console using this search filter box right down here below. So let's type in just the longitude value here, minus 122, and sure enough, our results are filtered out. We can see, jumping directly to this perfectly formed URL that gets the weather for San Francisco State. So feel free to explore this more if you'd like. You learned a lot in this video. You learned how APIs work. You learned how to set up your browser to show formatted JSON. You learned how to use URLSession to make an API call and how to print the JSON results of that call to the console. We also wrote code that was so reusable. We took everything we created, swapped out the DarkSky URL for one showing Pokemon, and then we caught them all right in our Xcode console. Feel skilled Swifter. API should stand for awesomeness personified indeed. That's you. Keep at it.